Hey, it's Drybear. It has officially been 1 week since the launch of Early Access for Path of Exile 2, and while people have been grinding their hearts away day in and day out, there is now an official leaderboard available for the classes that have made into the top 1,000 players for Standard League and Hardcore League, so I went ahead and collated the data together so we can look at what people are choosing and which classes are doing the best. So I just threw this together very quickly. These numbers are hopefully going to change over time as people get higher and higher. So this is the summary of all classes in the top 1,000. I think this is probably the most useful and probably the most interesting stat. Obviously on hardcore things will change a bit as people play tankier classes or make different decisions on their character overall, and these are the people that have leveled the most. Now obviously we might see this change as people that have other responsibilities and can't play 12 hours a day or more to grind up to the highest, but it is kind of interesting how skewed this actually is and whether this is a representation of which classes are actually the strongest or which classes are just the most popular, right? It could be that the Acolyte of Chuyula is just very much undiscovered and people haven't started using it a lot yet, but it's kind of interesting to see that the top 5 for hardcore and standard as far as amount of people using those classes are identical. Infernalist Witch by far is the most used in hardcore. More than any other ascendancy or class combination, it is by far the highest, and it's also the highest in Standard League top 1,000 players, which is crazy. That witch player is that witch ascendancy is doing so well and is so incredibly popular, followed by the Stormweaver in the Standard League top 1,000, a little bit lower in hardcore. But what shocked me a lot about this was the fact that Titan was a little bit higher, just very like second place in used in hardcore. Now Titan, obviously Warrior has a little bit more survivability. You're gonna have more health and maybe some accessibles on the ascendancy talent tree to make it easier for you to be able to play that character and make it stronger and more durable so you don't die. But I was shocked to see Titan doing so incredibly well across the top 1,000. But I think the look at the Standard League actually shows a little bit of what people are thinking. The Infernalist Witch, the Stormweaver Sorceress, and the Deadeye Ranger being the by far the most used here is kind of interesting. They play a lot like some of the classes and experiences you'd have in Path of Exile 1 or maybe even in other ARPGs, whereas some of the classes that are a little bit new and weird, like Chronomancer for the Sorceress, Gemling Legionnaire for the Mercenary, that are just very out there. They have a lot of theory crafting that needs to be done, are just not making their way into the top. And what we can do is, you guys are interested, we can check in on this every single week and see what the distribution of the top 1,000 is, how it changes over time, and hopefully this starts to even out a bit as people try new classes, level up, do the league, or if there's ever a reset in early access, we can see what people decide to go with in general. But I think this part is just kind of interesting to see where things go. Invoker for Monk, it does seem like Monk, we looked at this before the game actually launched, that Monk was going to be one of the most popular classes in the game, although it seems like on the cutting edge of pushing, Invoker is up there, but nowhere near as high as, say, the Witch, the Warrior, or the Sorceress as far as being utilized for heavy grinding. But if you were to see a Monk, Invoker is more likely to be the Monk that you see, and they are doing pretty decently well compared to other classes and ascendancies. Apologies for the flashbang, but I wanted to try to break out the deaths in hardcore just to see if there was any thing to learn from that. A lot of people are saying right now that the melee classes are having a much harder time in the game, especially with the Trial of Sekhmet, which is based on taking hits versus not. In a lot of cases, ranged characters can sit further back, avoid taking damage, and especially in hardcore, it's kind of interesting to see if players if they end up dying more or less as ranged. So I actually broke out based on role. So this is the hardcore list that we just looked at for the hardcore top 1,000 of the percentage of those that I would consider melee or ranged. Now, admittedly, you could be running like a Stormweaver with a Monk quarterstaff doing melee and stuff like that. There's no way for me to know that from the top 1,000 list, so I'm just going to go based on the class and ascendancy itself, so it's not going to be perfect, but this tells you that overall, of the distribution, 72% of the people in the top 1,000 are playing a class that at its base is a ranged class, 27% are playing melee, so not really as much equalness as much as you would expect from that. However, if we look at these numbers here for hardcore of the class distribution, these are the amount of deaths that we have. And surprisingly enough, it's pretty close. This is actually what you would expect. A great example of this is like, you know, if you, wherever you live in the world, someone puts out a statistic that a certain car is the most stolen car out of any car. But then you find out that it's also the most popular car. So of course it's going to get stolen more on average. It doesn't necessarily mean the car is more or less valuable. It just means that there's more of them to steal, so there's going to be more of them stolen. In this case, is the same thing here. So statistically, if there are a lot more Infernalists, then you would expect that most of the deaths on hardcore characters were on Infernalists because there's so many of them. So generally you would expect that most of these numbers to line up based on popularity because there are just more of those people to end up dying and failing and losing at the end. And that's kind of what we see here. We can see Infernalist is played 32% of the time and 29% of the deaths were Infernalist. Titan actually survives on average better than most. You can see Titan dropping down a little bit, Stormweaver coming up. Stormweavers actually have a higher death percentage than their popularity. Deadeye seem to survive better in general. Invoker seems to be dying a little bit more. Gemling dying a little bit more. Dying a little bit more. Witch Hunter surviving a little bit better than most. Blood Mage looks like they're dying a little bit more. Warbringer dying a little bit more than average. Acolyte Chula about the same. Chronomancer about the same. And Pathfinder a little more deaths than their popularity. But they loosely follow the popularity representation, which means that death comes for us all. You can actually see in the representation here of the hardcore deaths, 72.2% of the hardcore top 1000 are ranged classes, and 72% more or less are the deaths. Same thing for melee, 27.00, 27.26, which means that death comes for us all. It doesn't necessarily mean that melee, I don't see anything significant enough here to say that melee die more based on their weighted percentages than ranged. Death comes for us all. It seems like everyone kind of dies in hardcore regardless, and as we learn more about the game and try new builds and stuff like that, it'd be interesting to see how this changes overall. But I wanted to break this out as a general representation of who's being played in hardcore, who's living and dying in hardcore, just so we can see what week 1 is like. Now, I'm just curious what you think about this in general. I was actually shocked to see this so disparate. I think it makes sense that class like ascendancies like Gemling, Legionnaire, or Chronomancer that are just so bizarre, like they're just way out there. They do something brand new that no one really expected, and I didn't really expect them to be super high. But I actually expected like the Shadow Monk, the Acolyte of Chayula, to be really high, considering how high Invoker is. In fact, the majority of people that are running each of these classes, like Monk specifically, are running Invoker. The majority of Warriors are running with Titan. The majority of Sorcerers, like almost 99% of the Sorceresses that are running in the league right now are playing Stormweaver over Chronomancer. So kind of a big disparate thing here. I know some people like these kind of stats. This might help you decide on what you want to make next. And I hope to see anything below this 50% line here, like Warbringer, Blood Mage, Pathfinder, Gemling, Chronomancer, Acolyte of Chayula. I would love to see more of those ascendancies being chosen and played, and they probably will be as time goes on. They just wanted to go, I guess, with what they were familiar with, like Titan, Invoker, Deadeye, Stormweaver, and Infernalist are all very familiar to classes that you'd expect normally. Maybe Monk would be a little bit different, but in general, these are all your ranged character, your caster, your witch style character with summons potentially, and your big heavy hitting, two-handed or dual wielding warrior that can do lots of damage. Another interesting fact is there was actually a handful of people that hadn't chosen their ascendancy even by level 50 or beyond. Now, some of this might be they were just afraid to do the ascendancy trial on hardcore, like to the point where they just didn't want to do it. I refuse to believe that players in the top 1000 for the launch of PoE 2 don't know what ascendancies are or what they can benefit you. I imagine they just didn't want to do them at the risk of death on hardcore specifically, or maybe they just didn't feel like it was necessary on standard. But there were a non-zero amount of people that just straight up did not do Trial of Secumus, did not do Trial of Chaos, and in the in-game had not unlocked any ascendancies at all, and hadn't even applied it to their character, but they were still just grinding and moving up to the top. But of course, let me know what you think about this distribution down below, if this matches what your expectations means we're going into the early access, where your ascendancy of choice lines up on this list, if you're near the top or near the bottom, or if this kind of information is something you'd like to see regularly from my channel, and if this inspired you to make a new class, maybe we get some of these lower end ascendancies some love going into next week. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.